This white blanket in Darling River is made up of millions of dead fish. The rotting remains of mainly bream, cod and perch are clogging Australia's second longest river. And they're disrupting the lives of people in the small town of Menindee.
You're walking around in a dried up mess and then you're smelling this putrid smell. And it's a terrible smell and horrible to see all those dead fish.
Local authorities say unusually hot weather has led to a large algal bloom in the rivers. This, coupled with receding floodwaters and drying riverbeds, have starved fish of oxygen. In a statement, the New South Wales State Department says the hot weather is exacerbating hypoxia. As warmer water holds less oxygen than cold water, the fish have higher oxygen needs at warmer temperatures. This is the third mass die-off of fish in the Darling River. In 2019, nearly 1 million fish perished there. But the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries says the latest is the worst, with hardly any fish being left alive.
It's just that feeling of hopelessness, that no one wants to take any responsibility for it. And really all we want is to maintain a healthy river.
Authorities say fish populations usually boom during the floods and then fall as floodwaters recede. But local people blame poor water management. They say more needs to be done to improve the drainage and quality of water to prevent another wall of dead fish. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera.
All right, here we go.
This is the only way Teresa Garcia can get around to feed her animals and retrieve any of her belongings. A river burst its banks and flooded this rural town in central California on Thursday. People here say the fast-moving floodwater destroyed everything in its path within minutes.
We're shocked that all this happened as quick as it did. So now we're all, we don't know what we're going to do because evidently we're not going to be able to come back here and live anymore. So we're going to have to just take our losses.
In Southern California, some in the coastal city of San Clemente were forced to leave their apartments as the earth slid away from their backyards. At least 35 out of 58 counties are on a presidential emergency declaration for areas hard hit by natural disasters.
I think everyone should understand we have a dynamic situation here. We have another rainstorm coming. The ground is continuing to move. So these structures are still in peril. And from a city's perspective, again, safety first. So we're going to make sure that everything's set before we get the go-ahead for folks to come back in.
The United States West Coast is facing an unusually wet season after 2 decades of drought. It's endangered lives, destroyed homes and turned roads into rivers. There have been power outages too, and with rain in the forecast, there's likely to be more flooding in the next few days. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera.
As people try to recover from the impact of Cyclone Freddy, they also have to bury the dead. And as the rain continues, here in the village of Tauchira, they have to scoop water out of grave pits before laying the victims to rest. More than 320 people have now been confirmed dead, and thousands more are missing after the cyclone tore through southern Africa for a second time in weeks. Outside Malawi's commercial capital Blantyre, people in this village have been cut off from their neighbors as roads and bridges lay in ruin. President Lazarus Chakwera has appealed for international assistance, while his government's been criticized for not doing enough.
The main challenge is not government failing to respond. It is the inaccessibility of some of these camps because bridges have been washed off and roads have been cut, so that people cannot travel to where they are. So there is help that is already on hand. It cannot get to the people because of challenges of accessibility.
In some parts, there's no electricity or running water.
We have people who have been rendered homeless. They don't have food, they don't have clothing, they don't have water, clean water. So it's really bad. We don't even know what people are going to eat for lunch today or even supper. We don't know because we have not yet received any relief item as we speak.
Across the country, more than 88,000 people have been displaced, with many sheltering in temporary camps. More rain is expected in the next few days, raising fears of flash floods and more destruction.
Berta Santos is helpless. Under the rubble are her children's beds, her sofas and tables. She was only able to recover 2 pots, a cutting board and a toy.
Everything is gone. The kitchen, everything. There is nothing left.
Cardboard, wooden and tin homes were ravaged by 2 landslides that tore through the community of Rio Seco, southwest of the capital. More than 1,000 homes were flattened and nearly 2,500 people affected. Wilber says his home was spared. It sits between his neighbor's brick walls.
I'm so sad for those who have lost everything. It's nature. We can't find it. We never know when it's coming.
The effects of Cyclone Yaku have been devastating in Peru's north and central coast. The capital, Lima, is on state of red alert. In this southwestern district of Cieneguilla, 7 landslides happened simultaneously. 120 soldiers delivered water and food to survivors here. Heavy machinery cleared roads. The force of nature only spared the most solid constructions. For years, authorities have urged people not to build their homes near riverbanks or ravines like this one. This is a natural path for landslides, but poor people will likely settle here again. For now, the mayor of Cieneguilla set up tents to shelter many of the homeless and distribute food and other donations.
In 2017, El Nino caused so much tragedy, but this is much worse. Only here, landslides in 7 ravines and families losing all. I feel so useless.
The disaster zone is being cleared, but the danger remains.
We have to understand deep down that people don't want to move. Families don't want to go to the shelters because they don't want to leave their family homes.
For most of these poor Peruvians, their homes were all they had, and now even those are gone. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, Rio Seco, Cieneguilla.
Chunks of the main road linking Hasaka and Raqqa in northeastern Syria have been washed away. And in the fields around it, crops of wheat, barley and vegetables have been destroyed just as they would have been taking root. Heavy rains have raised river levels that have flooded homes as well as the tents of Syrians internally displaced by the civil war.
I live alone as my husband is dead. The house flooded while I slept. My sons rescued me. All my possessions are wasted. I've lost everything. I only have the clothes on my back. We spent the whole night in the open.
This region in Syria has been controlled by rebel forces for 12 years. There's not much maintenance of public roads, buildings and facilities. The area is home to around 4.5 million people, according to UN figures. 70% of them are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera.
Every year, polluted air in India's capital city between November and January contributes to the deaths of thousands of people, including children. Although air pollution in New Delhi has long been a problem, how the haze develops has been poorly understood.
You'll have very clear nights in Delhi sometime, but then there are other nights where just things will develop very fast, maybe starting with 5 p.m. By midnight, you will start seeing that appearance of haze. And then by wee hours in the morning, you will find that there's really a thick haze.
Scientists know how pollutants become more dangerous in sunlight when gases react and lead to smog, as has been documented in Beijing. But it wasn't clear what was happening at night in New Delhi. So chemists in the city deployed 1,400 sensors on rooftops to monitor the air. What they found surprised them. As the temperature dropped and humidity rose, minute particles grew fast, forming ultrafine ones, 10,000ths of the width of a human hair. They were mostly made up of organic molecules. So the scientists realized they must have come from vapor from burned materials like wood. The molecules turned to vapor, then condensed like seeds in the cool air, then grew in the presence of water. That connection had not been known before.
Whatever is getting burned or being combusted in and around Delhi, it's simply contributing to this haze formation.
The process peaked after midnight, before tapering off as commuters headed to work before 9 a.m., when the haze was thickest. Now that the transformation is understood, it could help city planners and public health and aviation officials. But some say they face substantial challenges.
We don't have infrastructure to provide heating to the low-income population of the city. We don't have infrastructure to provide clean cooking as of now, and we're building it. As long as these problems are not solved, biomass burning is not going away.
It's data that may also prove useful to a world that is seeing more wildfires near more population centers every year. Colin Baker, Al Jazeera.
Streets littered with crumbled facades. Rescue teams in Ecuador scramble to save those still trapped after the earthquake on Friday afternoon.
A part of a facade collapsed and fell on a vehicle that had already been removed by the police. We had one victim without vital signs, a male person.
A number of buildings have collapsed across the coastal state of El Oro and Azuay in the Andes.
People ran out. They yelled in despair. All the people got out of their cars. I don't know how an earthquake would feel in a car, but they were desperate. They ran, they yelled, they cried.
There are reports of damage to infrastructure across the region and landslides blocking several roads. The tremor was also felt across the border in northern Peru, where a young child was killed when her home collapsed.
The baby was playing where the stain of blood is. She was playing with my other niece and the brick fell on her.
Ecuador and Peru are prone to earthquakes. They straddle the so-called Ring of Fire, and the danger isn't over yet, with aftershocks still ongoing. Alex Beard, Al Jazeera.
This is how prices are decided at Asia's largest onion wholesale market. Farmers and traders from nearby areas meet in the town of Lasalgaon every morning. Today, their mood is somber. They say they are struggling because of falling prices.
I lost more than $1,300 this season. I'm now in debt. I can't even run my house. I'm worried if I'll be able to grow onions next year. I'm scared my debt will increase and I'll be stuck in cycle of loans.
The western state of Maharashtra is India's largest producer of red onions. Recently, prices dropped by half, creating a big crisis in the region. Growers are blaming this on surplus produce, estimated to be around 30%. Farmers here say government policies are making it difficult for them to export onions. Climate change has also impacted onion supply. Higher than usual temperatures and unseasonal rain have reduced the shelf life of these onions, forcing farmers to bring them earlier to markets before they rot. Traders say they're trying to revive the market before the summer harvest arrives. They're encouraging customers to buy at lower prices and working with farmers to find long-term solutions.
These red onions cannot be stored for too long, but pink onions have a longer shelf life, so we are asking farmers to expand warehouses for those. We are also suggesting they grow varieties that can be exported to regions like Europe and the Middle East. So next time there's a crisis here, we can sell the produce there.
Last week, thousands of farmers started marching to Mumbai to demand financial assistance. They ended their protest after the state government agreed to their demands. Those include subsidizing prices and waiving loans. Some say the solution is only a temporary fix.
The entire system needs to be overhauled. Right now, political parties interfere and decide who's allowed in the market. There should only be buyers and farmers, no one else. Additionally, farmers need to learn to balance onion production with demand so they can get a good price.
Harvest season is expected to begin next month. Farmers hope they'll benefit from new policies and start recovering their losses. Pavni Mittal, Al Jazeera, Lasalgaon, Western India.
Vladimir Putin has visited Russian-occupied Mariupol in Ukraine. The city is in the Donetsk region, which was annexed by Moscow last year. The Russian president drove around several districts of the city on Saturday and then was shown restoration work at a theater and a university. Putin's trip comes after he traveled to Crimea to mark the 9th anniversary of its annexation from Ukraine. And a deal allowing the export of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea ports has now been extended. Ukraine was seeking an extension of 4 months, but Russia only wanted 60 days. Let's bring in Stephanie Decker from Kyiv for more on that grain deal. This was expected, was it not, Steph?
It was expected, in a way, to be renewed, and the real sticking point, and it's interesting, the United Nations being very diplomatic, if you will, in its language when it announced that it would be extended. Also, the Turkish leadership, both the UN and Turkey, are the interlocutors, if you will, between Russia and Ukraine when it comes to this deal, saying that the deal had been extended, but not talking specifically about how long. The deal stipulates it should be extended by 120 days. The sticking point now from Moscow is it only wants to extend it for 60 days because it says that sanctions on things like its banking system and insurance are actually affecting its own exports, which isn't upholding the part of the deal that affects Russia. So it's clear, reading between the lines, that these negotiations are continuing about quite how long it is set to be renewed. The issue is, particularly for the farmers here, we've been talking to them, is that they need long-term stability when it comes to planning. The harvest here is around June. The new farmer's year, if you will, starts in July. So if this is going to be extended for 60 days or even for 120 days, which is 4 months, we were being told that it simply isn't enough. The minimum, really, what is needed for stability is a year. But at the moment, that is certainly not on the table. And again, it's hugely significant. Russia controls the Black Sea. This is what Ukraine needs to ship its wheat, grain, sunflower oil, the biggest producer in the world, which is why it has such a global impact and which is why this deal is so important. And certainly Russia holds a lot of leverage when it comes to that.
And tell us more about Vladimir Putin's visit to Mariupol.
Well, I think you probably just showed pictures of the Russian president driving himself around the city. It's the first time he visits the city since the war began. It's also 3 days after the deadliest anniversary. You may remember Russia bombing the theater in Mariupol. Mariupol endured a savage assault. That theater was sheltering hundreds of civilians, and that was bombed on the 16th of March in one of the deadliest incidents of this war. Well, now, almost a year later, he is touring the city, talking about reconstruction. It comes off the back of also visiting Crimea on the 9th anniversary of Crimea's annexation, and also a defiant sign, I think, showing him traveling. The fact that now the Russian president is liable to be arrested in 123 countries when it comes to this arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. Well, certainly he doesn't face that danger when it comes to the territories that Russia has annexed. So yes, first time we've seen the Russian president touring these areas properly, talking about reconstruction. But of course, particularly when it comes to Mariupol, that city was hugely devastated by the Russians in the war last year.
Thank you so much. Stephanie Decker reporting from Kyiv. Hello, Sunday marks 20 years since the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the U.S.-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein. The military operation was launched without UN support, unlike the first Gulf War or the invasion of Afghanistan. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, looks at how the invasion damaged the credibility of the United Nations.
UN weapons inspectors in Iraq, their job to track down the country's chemical and biological weapons. We now know there weren't any. The former Iraqi ruler Saddam Hussein had ceased his WMD program years earlier. But in 2003, US President George Bush, backed by the British Prime Minister Tony Blair, was saying he was hiding a huge stockpile, and they claimed they had the intelligence to prove it. The US Secretary of State Colin Powell, now known to have been privately sceptical himself, tried to make the case in the Security Council, even wielding a vial he said could be anthrax. The US and UK, bitterly opposed by much of the international community, including France and Germany, failed to get a Security Council resolution to authorise a war. They launched one anyway. In the aftermath, one British diplomat who'd worked as his country's expert on Iraq in the Security Council resigned. Do you think the United Nations ended up damaged or strengthened by the war 20 years ago?
I think without doubt it was damaged by it. The Secretary General of the United Nations didn't assert his authority to say that the war was illegal and should not happen, which later he admitted. And I think collectively, the quote unquote UN, this sense of a global community of nations, a sense of a shared set of rules, took a very big hit as a result of the Iraq War.
So where does that leave things now, 20 years on? Once again, the Security Council is deeply divided, and there's no doubt that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, a permanent member, was a breach of international law and of the UN Charter. But Western diplomats, when you speak to them privately, will tell you that their efforts to put pressure on Moscow are even now hindered by the memory of what happened 2 decades ago. The run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003 was marked by defiance and disinformation, resulting in deep damage to the UN system and the rule of law around the world. So much may have changed since, but the repercussions of events that haunted the UN then are still being felt. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
We have our correspondent Osama bin Javed, who's joining us from Baghdad. So, Osama, it's been 2 decades of change and upheaval for Iraqis. What do they believe that they've lost and gained?
Well, it depends on who you speak to here in the capital, Baghdad. Many people are going about their business as they mark 20 years. There isn't anything to commemorate. Most Iraqis would tell you that in the last 20 years, yes, there have been improvements, but in comparison to what they've lost, there is no equation there. They will tell you that they've lost social security, they've lost the sense of cohesion in their society, and they've lost an Iraq which used to stand on its own feet. Iraq stands divided along sectarian and ethnic lines, and Iraq has not been able to find its place economically and politically to stand amongst the nations. In these last 20 years, Iraqis have faced the worst of wars, which started with the invasion, then there were sectarian wars, and then came ISIL. And only now they've started to recover from what was the mess that was left behind. But we went to the city of Basra in southern Iraq, where we asked people, because that used to be the flashpoint, one of the first pitched battles were fought there, and we asked people there, what do they think of the invasion?
Basra's famous Italian bridge wasn't here 20 years ago. Neither was the main road that leads to Basra's international stadium. Now the streets are peaceful and there's relative political calm in the city and across Iraq.
We've achieved more than $8 billion of foreign investment up to February 2023. We are keen to achieve major projects. This is all in coordination with the federal government. Lots of projects were completed in Basra related to infrastructure, services, commercial and tourism sectors.
This oil field is named Majnoon, which means crazy in Arabic. Some say that refers to the large amount of oil reserves found here in one location, an estimated 38 billion barrels. The Majnoon field produces 240,000 barrels a day for Iraq's economy, and production is planned to be expanded to 5.5 million barrels per day. Iraq's government says despite obstacles like corruption, red tape, and an unstable region, investors are lining up. They're mainly interested in the country's abundant deposits of gas. But despite its large hydrocarbon resources, Iraq imports a third of the gas it needs for its power stations. Nearly $2 billion worth comes from Iran, and on a stretched budget, that's a burden. Iraq also spends an estimated $5 billion on importing diesel and petrol. That's left Iraq's currency struggling against the dollar. And that's not all.
As estimated by a parliamentary committee, corruption costs around $10 billion a year. Around $600 billion have been smuggled out of Iraq in the past years. We have to fight against corruption, administrational and financial. There's no real development in the Iraqi economy.
Despite that wealth, millions of Iraqis struggle to get clean water every day. And every year, thousands of people fall ill due to waterborne diseases. Drying rivers and climate change has increased risks of food shortages. 2 decades ago, the first battles of the Iraq War were fought in Basra. A city of 1 million people was besieged by mainly British forces. Cluster munitions were used, and the International Coalition to Ban Uranium Weapons says UK and US forces used depleted uranium.
20 years after the invasion, a lot has changed, yet this province continues to remain the backbone for Iraq's oil-based economy. But still, the complaints of the people are a lack of jobs, opportunities, infrastructure, and a lack of attention from the people in power. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Basra.
Well, 20 years later, a quarter of Iraq's population remains below the poverty line, a number that has increased in the last few years. Iraq's deposits in its foreign reserves have risen to $100 billion, yet on the streets of Baghdad, when you go around, people will tell you that the infrastructure is there from the time of Saddam. Nothing seems to have changed for them, not schools, not hospitals, not basic services. And that is, according to them, what is the legacy of the US-led invasion, which has left Iraq in tatters, and not enough has been done to bring it back on its own feet.
Thank you so much. Osama bin Javed reporting from Baghdad.
Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, superpower leader, and now a wanted man.
For the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation.
The president of the International Criminal Court announcing that arrest warrants have been issued for 2 Russian officials, one of them Mr. Putin. Human rights activists were quick to welcome the news.
This is an amazing day for the many victims of Russia's war crimes against Ukrainians since 2014, because this war has been going on since then, almost a decade. Vladimir Putin is now officially a wanted man.
But at the same time, the arrest warrant for President Putin almost certainly complicates the possibility of any diplomacy to end the war. The UN in particular is in a difficult position.
Will the Secretary-General still talk or meet with President Putin?
I don't want to answer hypothetical questions because, as you know, issues of travel involve others. We will continue, as a general rule, the Secretary General will speak to whomever he needs to speak in order to deal with the issues in front of him.
In the Security Council, the Russian ambassador made a blistering attack on the court.
The ICC is a puppet in the hands of the collective West, which is always willing to carry out pseudo-jurisdiction based on their orders.
123 countries are signatories to the Rome Statute that governs the ICC. They're now obliged to arrest the Russian leader and send him to The Hague. It's likely President Putin's travel will now be seriously curtailed. Of course, an arrest or a trial isn't going to happen anytime soon, but it's clear the International Criminal Court is sending a message not just to President Putin, but to the officials and military officers who work for him, that one day they could face consequences for their actions. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
It wasn't the outcome the French government wanted, but without a parliamentary majority, it decided to force its pension reform bill through Parliament by decree, a controversial move that infuriated some lawmakers and left the French Prime Minister struggling to be heard.
We can't risk seeing 175 hours of parliamentary debate come to nothing. We can't risk seeing the compromise built by the 2 houses dismissed. We cannot risk the future of our pensions. This reform is necessary.
The move comes after more than 2 months of street protests and strikes against the reform, led by France's trade unions, who say it's an erosion of workers' rights. They're also angry over plans to raise the retirement age by 2 years to 64. Demonstrators who gathered outside the parliament say they'll continue to fight.
Also pretty revolting is the fact that despite the fact that the government represents a tiny minority and doesn't even have a majority in the parliament, there are the constitutional tools that they can use to force it through in completely undemocratic manners, but that won't hinder our resolve to pursue the fight. That's why we're here today, and that's why the fight will continue tomorrow.
Forcing a bill through the parliament by decree is legal under the French constitution, but it is a course of action seen by many as a failure of politics. Reacting outside the National Assembly, France's hard-left leader said the government didn't care about people.
I find it significant and symbolic that for 100th time the government used a decree to bypass the will of the people. We must coordinate with the unions and do all we can to have this law withdrawn.
Reforming the pension system was one of President Emmanuel Macron's campaign promises. He says the system's outdated, costly and unsustainable for future generations. In the end, he will have succeeded in changing it, but at a cost to his political reputation. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.